Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to objectively map out some highly charged, genuinely fascinating arguments that are currently broadcasting across right-wing Australian media. Specifically, we're diving into a recent Sky News Australia panel discussion that intensely debates the nation's current trajectory. Now, we aren't here to take sides. Instead, we're going to break down exactly what these commentators are arguing, how they construct their narrative, and why they believe Australia is facing a multi-front crisis. Let's jump right in. Here's our quick roadmap for today. First, we'll tackle the economic immigration argument. Second, the politics of citizenship. Third, one nation's agenda. And fourth, debating cultural assimilation. All right, starting us off with Section 1, the economic immigration argument, growth or decline. So the source material kicks off with a massive macro view of Australia's living standards. The panel relies really heavily on historical comparisons to argue that the country right now is functioning entirely on population growth rather than genuine underlying prosperity. Take a look at the per capita growth across different eras here. On the left, we've got the eras of Fraser, Hawke, Keating, and Howard. The panel looks at these as periods of high per capita growth where Australians collectively actually grew wealthier. But as you move to the right, into the Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull, and Morrison years, you can see that growth starts to shrink. And finally, they point to the current Albanese government, arguing it has delivered what they call absolutely pathetic and minimal per capita growth, claiming it's only being masked by heavy immigration. And this right here brilliantly illustrates the incredibly vivid rhetoric they're broadcasting to their audience. To really hammer home their economic argument, the panel frames the nation's reliance on migration as this unhealthy physical addiction. I mean, they literally compare the economic strategy to a drunk who's terrified of the withdrawals if they just stop drinking. They call the entire system a Ponzi scheme, which is a really powerful phrase, right? It's meant to suggest that the Australian economy is just an unsustainable illusion that's actively degrading everyday living standards. Now, the panel directly ties this huge overarching economic theory to a pain point that Australians feel every single day, the housing crisis. They point specifically to the 5% deposit amount on heavily advertised Aussie homebuyer loans, and they even note that these are being advertised overseas. So they argue this high migration, low deposit model is inducing a massive, severe crisis. They claim that government-push schemes are actively trapping households in catastrophic negative equity. They actually go so far as to label the whole situation sheer economic vandalism. Moving right along to Section 2, the politics of citizenship, minting voters. Building on those economic grievances, the commentators pivot over to accusations of deliberate political engineering. The broadcast highlights this highly cynical theory regarding a citizenship pipeline. Essentially, they claim that the massive migration intake has created these huge waiting lists for citizenship ceremonies. But, they argue, it's not just an administrative backlog. The panel claims the federal government is purposely pressuring local councils, specifically in areas like Western Sydney, to aggressively fast-track these ceremonies. And the alleged goal? To literally mint thousands of new Labour voters right before the next election in crucial marginal electorates. Now, the really crucial point here is the data they use to back this up. Citing a Labour pollster, the panel asserts that a staggering 80% of the rapidly growing Indian migrant demographic intends to vote Labour. To the panel, this is absolutely no accident. They view it as a highly calculated move to lock in a permanent electoral advantage and fundamentally shift the balance of power in those key marginal seats. Okay, that brings us to Section 3, One Nation's Agenda, Policy Proposals. So, having laid out all their fears, the panel pivots to solutions, and they end up showering praise on Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party for tackling what they consider completely untouchable political realities. A major focus is One Nation's proposal to completely abolish climate change authorities. The commentators do not hold back here. They label these institutions and green initiatives as expensive garbage and boondoggles. They argue that dismantling this entire infrastructure is the very first necessary step to free up billions of taxpayer dollars, which they say absolutely must be redirected to reducing the national debt. And to really emphasize their frustration with the mainstream political class, they draw a super sharp contrast on climate policy. They openly chastise the Australian coalition, the traditional center-right party, for refusing to pull out of the Paris Accord, essentially treating climate change as this great untouchable topic. Meanwhile, they point directly across the Tasman Sea to New Zealand. The commentators heavily praise New Zealand's recent withdrawal from the Paris Accord, using it as a direct model of what to do, demanding that Australia followed their lead to reclaim its economic sovereignty. Finally, we land on Section 4, cultural assimilation, the burqa debate. Here, the broadcast wades into the incredibly complex waters of social identity, which gets sparked by a pretty intense debate on banning the burqa. It's really vital to look at exactly how the panel defines the terms here. Commentator Rita defines it strictly in negative terms. She calls it a form of reverse integration, reverse assimilation, and a tool of oppression. She goes so far as to label it gender apartheid, that intentionally segregates vulnerable groups from the mainstream culture. So in their view, banning it isn't even controversial. It's just a necessary step to enforce integration and protect Australian cultural values.
But what makes this segment so fascinating is a rare moment of internal debate on the panel. On one side, you have James pushing back a bit, arguing that Australia shouldn't graft European problems onto its own society. His view is that Australia's primary issue is strictly the vast size and volume of the lethal immigration system. But on the other side, Rita argues that the burqa is a vital symbol. Her perspective is that if a government is too afraid to ban something worn by only a tiny minority of people, well, it proves they've lost all control over the national cultural debate entirely, making it basically impossible to tackle larger, more consequential issues.
And that brings us to the end of our breakdown. We've seen how this broadcast weaves together a stagnant per capita economy, the housing crisis, accusations of voter engineering, climate skepticism, and strict cultural assimilation into one highly cohesive, really urgent narrative. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves, how effectively will these highly structured, emotionally resonant media arguments actually connect with everyday voters? And ultimately, how will this intense blend of economic anxiety and cultural identity shape the ballot books in Australia's political future? It's going to be a fascinating dynamic to watch unfold. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I will catch you on the next one.